In the spring of 1834, a quiet church community in rural Kentucky was forced to confront a terror it could neither pray away nor explain. Two children barely old enough to read began speaking the names of the dead. They described murders no one had confessed to, graves no one admitted existed, and sins buried so deeply that only God was supposed to remember them. This is not a ghost story meant to entertain. This is a historical mystery that fractured a community, silenced a church, and left questions that remain unanswered nearly 2 centuries later. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Stay with us until the very end, and when this story concludes, leave a comment telling us how deeply it unsettled you, because what you're about to hear is not folklore crafted to frighten, not superstition meant to entertain, but a fragment of American history that was deliberately left unfinished. In the year 1834, Kentucky was not yet the settled place modern maps suggest. It was a threshold, a land caught between frontier and civilization, between law and wilderness, between faith proclaimed loudly and sins buried quietly. Communities did not form around cities, they formed around churches. The church was the center of gravity. It was where births were recorded, where deaths were mourned, where disputes were resolved, where morality was defined. To be cast out of the church was to be erased from society itself. And to be protected by the church was to be protected from scrutiny. The Cumberland foothills were especially isolated. Roads were little more than dirt paths carved by wagon wheels and memory. News arrived late, filtered through rumor and sermon. Outsiders were noticed immediately. Their presence lingered long after they left. People here lived by routine, planting, harvesting, praying, and anything that disrupted that rhythm was treated with suspicion. It was into this world that a traveling preacher arrived one early spring morning, his horse low with exhaustion, his clothes worn thin from years on the road. He introduced himself politely, carrying letters of recommendation from distant congregations. His voice was calm, measured, the kind that settled easily into the cadence of Scripture. He was welcomed, as most preachers were, because communities like this depended on men who claimed to speak for God. He did not arrive alone. With him were his twin daughters, both 9 years old, walking a half step behind him, close enough that their shadows overlapped in the late afternoon sun. People would later struggle to describe them accurately. Some said they were pale. Others said their skin was weathered beyond their years. Nearly everyone remembered their eyes. The twins watched everything, not with curiosity, with recognition, as if they were seeing familiar ground in an unfamiliar place. They did not smile when greeted. They did not wave. They did not cling to their father like frightened children. They simply stood, hands folded, heads slightly tilted, observing the faces around them as though committing them to memory. At first, the community did not find this alarming. Children were strange sometimes, twins especially so. People reassured one another that quiet children were often intelligent, that preacher, as daughters were raised with discipline, that the road made children solemn. These explanations were offered quickly, eagerly, as if people sensed, without yet understanding that explanation would soon be necessary. The preacher was offered lodging near the church. His daughters slept in the same small room beside him. They attended services as expected. They sat still through sermons that lasted hours, their posture perfect, their attention unbroken. When other children fidgeted or whispered, the twins remained silent, eyes fixed forward, listening with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable without knowing why. It was during the second Sunday service that something shifted. The preacher was midway through a sermon on repentance, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythm, when one of the twins quietly corrected him. Not loudly, not interrupting. She simply spoke a date aloud. At first, no one understood what she meant. The preacher paused, slightly annoyed, then continued. A moment later, the second twin spoke, naming a place mentioned in the sermon, but using its old name, one that had not been used in decades. A murmur rippled through the congregation. The preacher tried to regain control, offering a gentle rebuke. Children were not to speak during the word. The twins lowered their heads obediently. The service continued, but something had been disturbed. A hairline fracture in certainty. Afterward, people approached the preacher politely, commenting on his daughter's intelligence. He smiled tightly, assuring them they were simply well educated, that they spent long nights reading scripture and history. The explanation satisfied no one completely, but it was accepted. Acceptance, after all, is easier than inquiry. Over the following days, the twins began to speak more. At first, it was small things. They corrected elders on the dates of funerals. They named relatives long deceased, relatives no one had mentioned aloud. They described details of past events with unnerving accuracy, the color of a dress worn decades earlier, the words spoken during an argument everyone claimed to have forgotten. Each incident could be explained away individually, coincidence, overheard conversation. A good memory. People told themselves what they needed to believe, but belief began to strain. The turning point came during an evening prayer meeting held in the church's wooden sanctuary, lit by oil lamps that cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. The room was full. Prayer meetings were meant to cleanse the spirit, to bring confession into the light. Ironically, they often did the opposite. As the congregation knelt, one of the twins stood. Her voice was soft, almost respectful. She spoke a man's name. The man froze. Then she described how he had died, not metaphorically, not symbolically. She described the angle of the blow, the sound it made, the place where his body had been hidden. She described the smell of the earth after it was disturbed. The congregation erupted in chaos. People shouted for her to stop. The preacher rushed forward, grabbing her arm. She did not resist. She simply looked at him, and then the other twin spoke. She corrected her sister on one detail. Only someone present at the death could have known the correction. The man named in the description collapsed to the floor, screaming that the devil had entered the church. Others fled into the night. Some remained frozen, unable to look away from the children now standing silently at the front of the sanctuary. No official accusation was made that night. No confession recorded. The prayer meeting ended abruptly. People went home and barred their doors. They told themselves this was hysteria, that fear had exaggerated what they heard, that children could be coached, manipulated, mistaken. But the twins did not stop. In the days that followed, they began identifying locations in the surrounding woods, places no one visited anymore. They spoke of unmarked graves, of bones hidden beneath roots and stones. Men were sent to investigate, not because they believed the children, but because the words had planted doubt too sharp to ignore. Bones were found, exactly where the twins said they would be. The preacher tried desperately to regain control. He claimed his daughters were ill, overtired, suffering from spiritual affliction. He forbade them from speaking publicly. He attempted to leave town quietly, but the community would not let him. Fear had replaced hospitality. Questions demanded answers. People began to notice something else. The twins did not speak randomly. They spoke during sermons, during prayers, during moments of religious intensity, as if the act of worship itself summoned whatever knowledge they carried. When asked directly where their knowledge came from, they did not say God. They did not say angels. They did not say demons. They said nothing at all. Their silence was worse than any answer. By the end of that spring, the church had become a place of dread. Attendance dropped. Confessions surged. Old rivalries resurfaced. Men avoided eye contact. Women whispered behind closed doors. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, and the twins watched, always watching, as if waiting for something, as if time for them moved differently. This was the beginning of the end for that community, not because of what the twins revealed, but because of what their knowledge implied. That secrets do not stay buried, that faith does not erase guilt, that innocence can become a mirror in which the past is forced to look at itself. What happened next would shatter the church completely, and that is where the story truly begins. The days that followed did not feel like days at all. They felt stretched, thinned, as though time itself had become uncertain in the Cumberland foothills. People rose before dawn and lay awake long after nightfall, listening for sounds that had always been there, but now carried new meaning: the creak of wood, the cry of owls, the rustle of wind through trees that suddenly seemed to lean closer to the houses they had once merely surrounded. The church stood at the center of it all, not as a refuge, but as a wound that would not close. No one spoke openly about what had happened during that prayer meeting, not at first. Silence became a form of defense. Families told themselves that repetition would give the story weight, and weight would make it real. Yet silence did nothing to ease the fear. It only sharpened it, forcing everyone to replay the scene in their own minds, over and over, until memory and imagination blended into something far worse than truth alone. The twins were kept indoors, or so the preacher claimed. He told anyone who asked that they were unwell, weakened by fever, unsettled by travel. He spoke quickly, nervously, his sermons shortening each day, as though he feared his own words might summon something he could no longer control. He avoided the eyes of the congregation, he avoided questions, and in doing so he made the fear grow. Because the twins were still speaking, they spoke at home first, to their father, to the woman who brought meals, to anyone who came too close. They spoke quietly, without emotion, without malice. That more than anything unsettled those who heard them. There was no anger in their voices, no triumph, only certainty. The kind of certainty that does not argue, because it does not need to. One woman later recalled that one of the twins asked her why she still washed blood from her hands in the river instead of the basin behind her house. The woman laughed at first, assuming it a child's misunderstanding. Then the twin described the ring the woman wore on her finger the night. Her husband disappeared, how it caught the moonlight, how it scratched his cheek when she pushed him. The woman dropped her bucket and ran, screaming that the devil had taken the childless tongue. Rumors spread faster than sermons ever had. Men stopped meeting in groups. Conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached. Children were pulled indoors before sunset. The woods surrounding the settlement, once a source of hunting and livelihood, became forbidden territory. People spoke of them as if they were listening. The elders convened in secret. These were men accustomed to judgment, to deciding what was righteous and what was dangerous. Yet they could not agree on what they were facing. Some insisted the twins were possessed, vessels for something unholy drawn to a place already steeped in sin. Others argued that the children were being coached, manipulated by their father for reasons no one could yet grasp. A few, very few, suggested something far more terrifying, that the twins were not the source of the knowledge but its consequence. That suggestion was quickly dismissed. Consequence implied responsibility. Responsibility implied guilt. The elders decided the twins must be tested. They summoned the preacher and demanded he bring the girls before them. He resisted weakly, his authority eroded, his voice trembling as he pleaded illness, exhaustion, mercy. The elders were unmoved. They reminded him that the church had sheltered him, fed him, trusted him. In return, they demanded answers. The twins were brought into the meeting room at dusk, the light low and uneven, shadows stretching across the floor. They stood side by side, hands clasped, identical in posture and expression. When questioned, they did not look to their father. They looked at the elders. The first questions were harmless. Names, ages, places they had traveled. The twins answered politely, accurately. Their voices were soft, their words carefully chosen. Then the questions changed. An elder asked how they knew what they knew. The twins said nothing. Another elder demanded they explain the graves. One of the twins tilted her head slightly and asked why he had never told his wife where he buried the silver. The room erupted. Shouts, denials, accusations. The preacher tried to intervene, shouting scripture, praying aloud, begging God to intervene. The twins waited until the noise died down. Then the second twin spoke. She named a place in the woods. She described a hollow beneath an oak tree split by lightning. She said there were 3 bodies there, not 2 as the elder believed. She said the third was a boy. No one moved. When the elders finally ordered the twins removed, it was not out of concern for the children. It was out of fear of what might be said next. That night, a group of men went to the oak tree. They found bones, 3 sets. The news shattered what little restraint remained. Confessions followed, some whispered, some shouted, some denied even as evidence mounted. People accused one another. Old grudges resurfaced. The church, once the place where sins were forgiven, became the place where they were exposed. The twins were blamed for everything. They were accused of witchcraft, possession, manipulation. Mothers crossed the street to avoid them. Fathers forbade their children from speaking their names. The preacher, desperate and unraveling, began to echo the accusations himself, perhaps hoping that aligning with the crowd would save what little authority he had left. Yet even as he condemned them, the twins continued. They spoke of deaths that had never been reported, murders disguised as accidents, men lost to the woods who had never wandered at all. They described the sound of bones breaking, the weight of soil, the prayers spoken afterward to erase memory. They did not accuse at random. They named names only when pressed, only when the weight of silence seemed too heavy to bear. It was as though something within them responded not to curiosity, but to denial. The more the community prayed, the more the twins spoke. This terrified the faithful most of all. If prayer did not silence the knowledge, if prayer seemed to summon it, then what did that say about the nature of their faith, about the church itself, about the God they claimed to serve? The preacher attempted one final act of control. He announced a cleansing service. a night-long vigil meant to purge the church of whatever evil had taken root. Fasting was ordered, confession encouraged. The twins were to be present, seated at the front, surrounded by elders who would pray over them until the source of their knowledge was driven out. The vigil began at sundown. It ended before midnight. Witnesses later struggled to describe exactly what happened. Accounts varied, fractured by fear and shame. What they agreed upon was this: the twins did not scream. They did not convulse. They did not resist. They spoke. They spoke names faster than the elders could pray. They spoke of buried ledgers, stolen land, poisoned wells. They described crimes that implicated not just individuals, but families' entire lineages built on blood and silence. They spoke of the church itself, of money taken to hide deaths, of sermons crafted to redirect guilt away from those who paid most generously. One of the twins reportedly said, "This place was built to forget." The vigil collapsed into chaos. Candles were knocked over. Prayers dissolved into shouting. Someone struck one of the girls. It is unclear who. No one admitted to it later. By morning, the church doors were locked. Services were suspended indefinitely. The preacher announced his intention to leave Kentucky at once, claiming that the land itself was cursed, that God had withdrawn his favor. He packed his belongings in silence, refusing to meet the eyes of those who had once welcomed him. The twins were seen only briefly that day, pale and exhausted, seated in the wagon beside him. They never made it out of the foothills. By nightfall, both girls were ill. By dawn, one was dead. Before sunset, the other followed. The official cause was fever. No physician examined them. No autopsy was performed. They were buried quickly, quietly, without ceremony, in graves that were never marked. The preacher disappeared shortly after, leaving behind no forwarding address, no explanation, no apology. The church was abandoned, and the community, fractured, exposed, and terrified, returned to silence. But silence could not undo what had been revealed. The bones remained in the ground. The knowledge remained in memory. And the question that no prayer could answer lingered in the Cumberland foothills long after the twins were gone. How could two children know what an entire community had sworn to forget? And perhaps more frightening still, why did the truth speak only through them? After the twins were buried, the Cumberland foothills did not return to normal. They returned to routine, which was far worse. Normal implies healing. Routine implies suppression. The land did not erupt in chaos or open violence. Instead, it tightened inward like a body sealing around an infection it did not know how to cure. People went back to their fields. They reopened shops. They greeted one another with the same words they always had, but nothing underneath those words remained the same. The church door stayed shut. At first this was explained as temporary, a period of mourning, a time for reflection. Then weeks passed, then months. The wooden structure at the center of the settlement began to decay faster than it should have. Roof shingles loosened, windows cracked. Weeds crept up around the foundation as if reclaiming something that had been borrowed rather than built. No one volunteered to repair it. No one suggested reopening services. Faith did not vanish, but it retreated indoors, becoming private, fragmented, and deeply suspicious. People avoided speaking the twins' names, not because doing so caused anything supernatural to happen, but because speaking their names caused memory to surface. And memory had become dangerous. To remember was to connect details. To connect details was to risk implication. Silence, therefore, was not merely emotional avoidance. It was strategy. Children who had once played freely near the church were warned never to approach it again. Parents told them stories not about the twins, but about wolves, about unstable ground, about sickness carried by bad air. These explanations shifted over time, changing shape as children grew older, adapting to whatever version of fear seemed most effective. The truth was never offered. The truth required too many answers. Yet truth has a way of moving sideways when it cannot move forward. In the years that followed, accidents increased. Horses bolted unexpectedly. Tools failed at critical moments. Men fell ill after drinking from wells they had used all their lives. Women reported hearing voices calling their names from the woods at dusk. These incidents were explained individually, each given a rational cause: weather, age, carelessness. But the pattern was difficult to ignore. What truly unsettled the community, however, was not the misfortune. It was recognition. People began to notice that those most affected by these accidents were often the same individuals whose names the twins had spoken, the same families whose histories had been dragged into the light. the same households that had benefited most from the silence that once ruled the church. This correlation was never acknowledged publicly. It was discussed in whispers late at night, with doors locked and lamps turned low. Some interpreted this as divine justice delayed. Others saw it as coincidence amplified by guilt. A few, far more afraid, believed something had been left behind when the twins died, something unfinished, something that did not require bodies to speak. The preacher was never seen again. Letters were sent to other congregations asking if he had arrived. None had. His absence became another unspoken weight. Some believed he fled out of shame. Others believed he was silenced. The more imaginative feared he had been spared only because the twins were no longer alive to speak what he carried. Years passed. Children grew into adults who remembered the events only as fragments, raised voices, locked doors, parents arguing behind walls. Those fragments shaped them nonetheless. They learned early that asking questions was unwelcome. That curiosity carried consequences. That faith was safer when it did not look too closely at its own foundations. This generational shift altered the character of the settlement. Outsiders noticed it first. Travelers passing through described the people as guarded, polite but distant. No one lingered. No one invited strangers to stay. The foothills developed a reputation for being unfriendly, even hostile, though no open violence occurred. The hostility lived beneath the surface, in what was withheld rather than expressed. Eventually, a new church was built miles away. Smaller, plainer. Its sermons were careful, avoiding themes of confession, repentance, or judgment. The focus shifted to endurance, obedience, and acceptance. Sins were framed as personal burdens, not communal rot. Responsibility was individualized. Structure was preserved. But the land remembered. Farmers reported that certain plots would not produce crops no matter how they were worked. These plots corresponded eerily with the locations the twins had once described. Wells dug too deep collapsed. Trees planted too close to old burial sites withered. Animals refused to graze in particular clearings, circling them nervously before bolting as if startled by something unseen. No one mapped these occurrences. No one documented them. Documentation creates patterns. Patterns invite questions. Questions threaten stability. Still, stories traveled, not through official channels but through people who left. Young men who could not bear the silence. Women who married into other towns, laborers who passed through and sensed something wrong even if they could not name it. These people carried pieces of the story with them, never the whole thing, always incomplete, shaped by fear and uncertainty. By the mid-century, variations of the tale had spread across Kentucky and beyond. In some versions the twins were angels, in others demons. In a few they were victims of abuse who learned secrets by listening too closely. Each version stripped the story of its most uncomfortable implication, that the community itself had been the source of the horror. The truth was not supernatural in the way people preferred. It was structural. The twins had not introduced evil into the settlement. They had revealed it. This distinction mattered deeply, and it was why the story could never be resolved. Years later, a traveling doctor passed through the region and stayed long enough to hear fragments of the tale. Unlike others, he asked questions. He noted the recurring illnesses, the unexplained accidents, the geographical consistency of misfortune. He recorded what people would tell him privately, comparing accounts, noting contradiction. His journal, discovered decades later, contains a single sentence written repeatedly in the margins: "Silence is not peace, it is pressure." The doctor never published his findings. Neither did anyone else. By the time formal historians began examining frontier Kentucky, the events of 1834 had already been buried beneath layers of revision and omission. Church records from that year were incomplete. Pages were missing. Dates were altered. Names removed. The absence itself was conspicuous, but absence is difficult to cite as evidence. It invites speculation, not conclusion. Still, certain details survived intact. Multiple independent accounts referenced twin girls of the same age. Multiple testimonies described knowledge that could not be reasonably explained. Multiple burial sites matched descriptions given before they were disturbed. These overlaps troubled historians, even those determined to find rational explanations. Some proposed that the twins had been coached by adults seeking revenge. Others suggested that the community had been so small and insular that children could absorb secrets without realizing it. A few hypothesized that guilt had warped memory, that later discoveries were retroactively attributed to the twins. Each theory explained parts of the story, but none explained all of it. Most notably, none explained why the church closed permanently. Communities rebuilt churches after fires, floods, even massacres. Churches were restored after wars. But this church, this particular structure, was abandoned without explanation. The land was sold cheaply. No one reused the wood. No one reclaimed the stone. It was as if the place itself had been declared untouchable. By the late 19th century, the ruins were nearly gone, reclaimed by forest. Only locals remembered where it had stood. They avoided the area even then, generations removed from the original events. Fear, when inherited, does not require understanding to persist. Oral histories collected in the early 20th century contain references to the speaking children and the church that learned too much. Elders refused to elaborate. Some became visibly distressed when pressed. Others simply said, "It is better not to know how he came to be." That sentence appears repeatedly in transcripts from the region. Better not to know. This was the legacy the twins left behind, not terror alone, but an unanswerable dilemma. Because if two children truly accessed knowledge beyond their experience, then the world was far stranger than faith allowed. But if they did not, if their knowledge came entirely from within the community, then the community itself was far darker than it could ever admit. Either answer destroyed comfort, so silence won. Yet silence, as history repeatedly proves, is never permanent. In the early 1900s, as psychology and criminology emerged as formal disciplines, interest in unexplained historical cases increased. The story of the Kentucky twins resurfaced in obscure journals, often stripped of names and locations, presented as an example of mass hysteria or collective delusion. These papers rarely engaged with primary sources. They relied instead on second-hand summaries that softened the details. Even so, the case disturbed those who examined it closely. Because mass hysteria does not produce bodies in predicted locations, collective delusion does not align independent testimonies across decades. Coincidence does not account for consistency. The more the case was studied, the more it resisted categorization, which is why, ultimately, it faded again, pushed aside in favor of cases that fit more neatly into existing frameworks. Science prefers problems it can solve. Faith prefers mysteries it can sanctify. This story satisfied neither. And so it remained where it had always been, between explanations, between disciplines, between belief and doubt. In the Cumberland foothills, the woods grew thicker, trails shifted. New generations passed without knowing exactly what had happened, only that something had. The land kept its memory. The people learned not to ask. But every so often, after heavy rains, bones surfaced in places no one remembered burying anyone, and someone, usually a child, would ask a question. And an adult would say, without quite knowing why, "Some things are better left buried." That perhaps was the final cruelty of the story, not that two children spoke the truth, but that the truth, once spoken, made silence the only way forward. And silence, unlike truth, never stops asking its own questions. By the time the story should have faded into folklore, it had instead settled into something heavier, something that did not behave like legend at all. Legends soften over time. They gain embellishments, dramatic flourishes, comforting morals. What remained in the Cumberland foothills did not soften. It hardened. It became less dramatic and more structural, less theatrical and more embedded in daily life. The absence of the church, the silence around 1834, the generational habit of avoiding certain clearings in the woods, these were not ghost stories. They were behavioral patterns. And patterns are difficult to dismiss. In the decades that followed, the settlement changed physically, but its psychological architecture remained intact. Roads improved. Rail lines eventually crept closer to the region. Markets expanded. Yet the core of the community, the way it processed memory, the way it handled transgression, remained shaped by what had happened when the twins spoke. Confession, once central to the church's authority, was redefined. It became quieter, more private, often avoided altogether. Public repentance nearly disappeared. Sermons in the new church rarely focused on personal sin. Instead, they emphasized perseverance, humility, endurance under hardship. There was little mention of accountability. The language shifted from exposure to survival. This shift was not accidental. The generation that had witnessed the twins' revelations understood something instinctively. Exposure destabilizes power. The moment sins were named publicly, hierarchy fractured. Respected elders were reduced to accused men. Families were implicated. Wealth was questioned. The structure that had given order to their world nearly collapsed in a single season. The lesson learned was clear: never let it happen again. That lesson did not require formal agreement. It was absorbed through behavior, through what was not discussed at dinner tables, through the way children were redirected when they asked about the abandoned church, through the subtle tension that surfaced whenever an outsider expressed too much curiosity. Yet, even as the community protected itself from internal exposure, it could not entirely shield itself from external change. By the late 19th century, state authorities began standardizing record-keeping across rural Kentucky. Property disputes required documentation. Deaths were to be reported formally. Land ownership needed clear boundaries. These bureaucratic shifts threatened the carefully maintained silence of the foothills. Surveyors arrived. They did not know the history. They saw only land to be measured, plotted, taxed. In the process of mapping the region, they uncovered inconsistencies: parcels of land that had changed ownership without recorded transactions, grave sites unmarked but long known to locals, family plots that extended beyond declared property lines. One surveyor reportedly remarked in his notes that the ground here resists clarity. He meant it metaphorically. The locals did not. Whispers resurfaced. Some believed the twins' knowledge had never been exhausted, that what they revealed in Untold 34 was only a fraction of what the land contained. Others feared that bureaucratic scrutiny might accomplish what the children had begun: dragging forgotten crimes back into relevance. The tension between modernization and memory deepened. A particularly revealing incident occurred in 1899 when heavy rainfall caused a small landslide near one of the old clearings described decades earlier. The slide exposed fragments of bone and rusted metal objects, buttons, buckles, fragments of tools. Authorities were notified reluctantly. An investigation was opened briefly. The findings were inconclusive. The bones were too degraded to identify. No official link was made to past disappearances. The case was closed within weeks, but the event reignited the oldest fear: not that the twins had been wrong, but that they had not finished. The idea of unfinished revelation unsettled the community more than the idea of supernatural intervention ever had. If knowledge could resurface unpredictably through erosion, through accident, through curiosity, then silence was not control. It was delay. Some families left. They did not announce why. They cited economic opportunity, marriage, better prospects elsewhere. But their departures clustered around the same surnames that had once been spoken aloud in that wooden sanctuary in 1834. Patterns. Again, by the early 20th century, historians began taking interest in frontier religious movements, particularly those linked to the Second Great Awakening. Records from Kentucky were sparse but compelling. Mentions of a preacher who vanished, references to disturbances in church minutes, sudden gaps in documentation. Academic curiosity does not carry the same emotional weight as local memory. Researchers approached the material analytically, searching for psychological explanation. Some proposed that the twins may have suffered from a form of shared delusion, a phenomenon where closely bonded individuals reinforce one another as constructed realities. Others suggested that the community itself projected guilt onto the children, retroactively attributing discoveries to them after graves were found. These theories circulated quietly in journals few locals would ever read, but knowledge travels in strange ways. When a university researcher visited the foothills in 1912 to conduct interviews, he encountered resistance. Doors were closed politely. Conversations ended abruptly. The older generation refused to engage. The younger generation claimed ignorance. He noted in his field journal, "There is fear here not of the past itself, but of how it might be interpreted." That observation was more accurate than he realized. Interpretation determines responsibility. If the twins were frauds, the community had been foolish. If the twins were possessed, the community had been spiritually vulnerable. If the twins spoke truth drawn from lived reality, the community had been complicit in violence and concealment. Only one of those interpretations threatened lineage, and lineage, in a region where family-defined identity, could not be destabilized without consequence. By mid-century, the story had fractured into folklore variants told outside the region. In some versions, the twins were martyrs executed for witchcraft. In others, they were embodiments of divine judgment. None captured the quieter, more disturbing truth that their knowledge was not spectacular. It was specific. Specificity is what makes history dangerous. The more researchers examined surviving fragments, letters, diaries, oral accounts, the clearer one detail became. The twins rarely offered grand declarations. They did not preach. They did not threaten. They described. Descriptions do not require belief. They require only verification. And verification had occurred. That is why the church closed, not because of hysteria, not because of possession, but because confirmation is destabilizing. By the late 20th century, advancements in forensic science reopened interest in old burial sites across Kentucky. In theory, technology could do what rumor and memory could not: identify remains, establish timelines, assign cause of death. Yet the foothills were largely overlooked. Funding prioritized cases with living claimants. Political pressure influenced which histories were re-examined. Rural mysteries without clear legal stakes were left untouched, and so the land kept its secrets. Occasionally, a local would break from tradition and speak openly. A descendant of one of the implicated families might admit that stories had been passed down about a reckoning that came through children. An elderly resident might confess that certain names were avoided at gatherings because we were warned what happens when they are said aloud. These admissions rarely made headlines. They remained regional, contained, yet the psychological imprint of 1834 extended beyond the foothills. The case became a quiet reference point in discussions of collective guilt and communal denial. Scholars examining post-conflict societies cited it as an example of how exposure without structural reform leads to deeper silence. The pattern was familiar. Truth revealed abruptly, authority destabilized, reform resisted, memory suppressed. The twins had not been followed by accountability. They had been followed by retreat. This distinction shaped everything that came after. Communities that confront wrongdoing publicly often fracture before healing. Communities that suppress it remain intact externally but develop internal fault lines that surface unpredictably. The Cumberland foothills remained externally intact. Internally, they were shaped by absence. Absence of the church, absence of confession, absence of open historical record, absence of the twins' names. And yet the most profound absence was clarity. Even in the modern era, when digital archives and genealogical databases make historical reconstruction easier than ever, the events of 1834 precision, names were incomplete, dates inconsistent, documents altered. What survived was structure. A preacher arrives. Twin daughters speak. Graves are found. The church closes. The preacher disappears. The twins die. Everything else is fragment. But fragments, when aligned carefully, form a silhouette. That silhouette suggests not supernatural terror, but moral exposure. It suggests that two children became unwilling instruments through which buried violence surfaced. It suggests that the community's greatest fear was not what the twins knew, but what others might learn if they continued. And it suggests that their deaths, whether natural or not, resolved the immediate crisis without addressing the cause. Silence became policy, and policy, when unexamined, becomes culture. Today, the Cumberland foothills are quieter than they were in 1834. Modern homes stand where cabins once leaned. Roads are paved. Technology hums. Yet ask the right questions quietly, respectfully, and the old discomfort surfaces. Mention the abandoned church. Watch the shift in posture. Ask about twin girls in the 1830s. Notice the hesitation before denial. History is rarely erased completely. It is compressed, stored beneath routine, waiting for pressure. And pressure, as that traveling doctor once wrote in his margins, does not dissipate on its own. It accumulates, until someone forces it back into the light. In 1884, that force came in the form of two 9-year-old girls, and the community never recovered from what they said. By the time the 20th century matured into modernity, the events of 1834 had dissolved from active memory, but not from consequence. The Cumberland foothills no longer resemble the isolated frontier they once were. Roads cut through old growth. Timber was harvested in organized grids. Electricity reached homes that had once relied solely on oil lamps and prayer. But progress did not excavate what lay beneath the surface. It simply built around it. Generations born long after the twins. Deaths inherited not the story, but its behavioral residue. They inherited a cautiousness toward exposure, a reflexive distrust of inquiry, and an instinct to preserve order at the expense of disclosure. They did not know why these instincts existed. They assumed they were cultural traits, evidence of resilience, perhaps even humility. But culture is often memory transformed into habit. The abandoned church site eventually became indistinguishable from surrounding woodland. No marker remained. No official plaque ever acknowledged what occurred there. Yet older residents could still gesture vaguely toward the area and say, there was something once. They avoided the specifics. Specifics were dangerous. Specifics tethered the present to accountability. In the 1940s, a local schoolteacher attempted to incorporate regional history into her curriculum. She asked her students to interview grandparents about early settlement stories. Several returned with fragmented accounts of the year the children spoke. The teacher, curious, pursued the theme, encouraging the class to map references to unexplained graves and missing persons. The project lasted 2 weeks before complaints reached the school board. Parents objected. Not loudly, not aggressively, simply with the calm insistence that certain stories are not suitable for children. The teacher was advised to shift focus to agricultural history and Civil War veterans. She complied. The pattern held. Exposure met with redirection. Over time, however, the outside world became more difficult to keep at bay. Journalists exploring forgotten American mysteries occasionally stumbled upon references to the Kentucky Twins in old diaries and archived correspondence. The accounts were inconsistent, but the core elements aligned too closely to dismiss entirely. A traveling preacher, twin daughters, graves discovered precisely where described, sudden church closure. One investigative reporter in the 1970s traveled to the region intending to write a feature on unsolved frontier mysteries. He interviewed residents cautiously. Some laughed off the tale as folklore. Others insisted it was exaggerated superstition. Yet the reporter noticed something peculiar. Even those who dismissed the story avoided walking near the old church clearing at dusk. Behavior often contradicts rhetoric. The reporter's article, when published, was careful. It framed the case as a cultural curiosity rather than a moral reckoning. He quoted psychologists proposing shared delusion. He cited historians emphasizing the emotional volatility of the Second Great Awakening. He included a brief mention of bones discovered in the 80s on Tratis, but without detail. The piece received moderate attention and faded quickly. What remained unchanged was the community's internal logic. Silence maintained cohesion. Then came the era of digital archives. As records were scanned and indexed, cross-referencing became easier. Patterns that once required years of physical research could now be detected in minutes. A genealogist working on an unrelated family tree noticed that several men listed in early church rosters vanished from official records in the same year the twins were documented. She posted her observation in an online forum. Responses poured in. Amateur historians compared notes. Cemetery records were scrutinized. Newspaper archives were searched for missing person notices that never appeared. Slowly, without central coordination, a digital reconstruction of the 888-24 community began to form. The most striking discovery was not supernatural at all. It was statistical. The rate of unexplained disappearances in the decade preceding 884 was significantly higher than in the decades following. After the twins died and the church closed, disappearances declined sharply. Correlation is not proof, but it is signal. This signal troubled even the most skeptical observers. It suggested that whatever the twins had exposed had altered behavior permanently, not through redemption but through fear of exposure. If crimes had been committed prior to 834 and graves discovered accordingly than the twins, knowledge functioned as deterrent. Once revealed, the system of concealment became unstable. Violence, if it continued at all, became less frequent, less reckless. In this interpretation, the twins were not supernatural agents. They were catalysts. Catalysts do not create reactions. They accelerate them. This framework reframed the entire narrative. Instead of asking how two children knew impossible things, the more unsettling question emerged: how many people already knew and relied on silence to protect themselves? If knowledge was widely shared but unspoken, then the twins' voices were not isolated miracles. They were breaches in an existing wall of complicity. The possibility that the community's moral collapse had been collective rather than individual changed everything. It meant the church did not close because of hysteria. It closed because trust evaporated. When secrets surface publicly, the structure built upon them cannot survive unchanged. The digital reconstruction continued. A particularly revealing pattern emerged when researchers compared land transfers before and after 1834. Several parcels of land previously held by families implicated in oral accounts were redistributed within a decade of the twins' deaths. The transactions were legal on paper, but the timing raised questions. Was land transferred to distant families from scrutiny? Were alliances reorganized to preserve influence? These questions could not be answered definitively, yet the alignment of dates reinforced the idea that 1840 marked structural upheaval, not isolated panic. The more the past was analyzed, the clearer the psychological mechanics became. Communities built on shared silence maintain stability through mutual protection. When silence is broken unexpectedly, even truth delivered without accusation can destabilize that equilibrium. Individuals fear not only punishment, but reclassification, being seen differently by neighbors whose respect once shielded them. The twins' greatest disruption was not naming crimes. It was removing plausible deniability. Once graves were confirmed in locations described publicly, denial ceased to function, and denial had been the glue. Modern psychologists examining the case proposed that the twins may have overheard conversations, pieced together fragments, and spoken them without understanding their implications. This explanation comforted those who required rational closure, but it left one problem unresolved. Children do not typically identify burial sites accurately without prior physical exposure, and no evidence suggested the twins had explored those woods before speaking. The question of how they knew persisted, which brings the narrative to its most uncomfortable crossroads. There are only three plausible categories of explanation. First, the knowledge was supernatural. Second, the knowledge was constructed and later validated through coincidence. Third, the knowledge existed within the community already, and the twins simply articulated what others feared to say. The first explanation challenges science. The second collapses under statistical scrutiny. The third implicates everyone. The third suggests that the community, as horror, was not about spirits. It was about recognition. Recognition that secrets long normalized were neither forgotten nor forgiven. Recognition that innocence, embodied in children, could reflect back a moral ledger no one wanted audited. Recognition that faith, when used to shield wrongdoing, fractures under scrutiny. This recognition would explain the church as closure more convincingly than hysteria ever could. It would explain the generational commitment to silence. It would explain the persistent unease. It would explain why even today, when asked directly, some residents of the Cumberland foothills hesitate before answering questions about 1834. Silence is inherited when accountability is avoided. As modern scholars reassembled the fragments, a quiet consensus began forming, not publicly, not dramatically, but cautiously. The twins' story was less about supernatural terror and more about communal reckoning, and the reckoning was interrupted. Their deaths, whether from illness or other causes, halted the exposure before it could complete itself. The immediate crisis ended. The long-term consequences lingered. Had they lived, more graves may have been found, more names may have been spoken. The structure of power may have collapsed entirely. Instead, partial revelation froze into permanent ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed denial to survive. Denial allowed continuity. Continuity preserved identity. But preservation came at a cost. The cost was transparency. Today, historians approach the case not as horror but as caution. They see in it an early American example of how institutions respond to internal corruption, not by dismantling themselves, but by isolating the source of exposure. The twins became that source. Once removed, the institution stabilized, but stabilization does not equal absolution. It equals postponement, and postponed reckoning often resurfaces in subtler forms. In the Cumberland foothills, that resurfacing appears as generational weariness, as quiet distrust of authority, as reflexive avoidance of uncomfortable topics. The land itself may not speak, but behavior does. If the twins' voices once forced a community to confront buried truth, their silence afterward forced it to live with unresolved tension. This tension never erupted dramatically again. It did not need to. It became embedded. Which brings us back to the essential question, not whether the twins were supernatural, not whether science can explain their knowledge, but whether explanation matters more than consequence. Because regardless of origin, their words changed the trajectory of the foothills permanently. Disappearances declined. Public confession retreated. Institutional power recalibrated, memory fractured. The story survived not because it was frightening, it survived because it was destabilizing. And destabilization, once experienced, leaves permanent imprint. In 1834, two 9-year-old girls spoke names others dared not say. What followed was not exorcism, it was restructuring. And restructuring, when born from exposure rather than reform, carries its own quiet horror, one that does not scream, does not haunt visibly, but lingers in the space between what is known and what is allowed to be acknowledged. That space remains, and it is there, in that silence, that the true mystery lies not of spirits, but of human willingness to bury what should have been confronted. What makes a story endure is not always what can be proven. Sometimes it is what refuses to disappear. The Kentucky twins should have faded into obscurity, two children in a remote settlement, wrapped in rumor, buried without markers, absorbed into the silence of rural America. Instead, their presence became a structural absence, a hollow in the historical record that refused to collapse inward. The more modern research advanced, the more the outline of what happened in 1834 sharpened, not through spectacle but through omission. By the time the 21st century arrived, digital tools allowed independent researchers to revisit fragments that had once required years of travel and permission to access. Church minutes, land deeds, tax ledgers, and death records could now be layered side by side. Patterns that once felt anecdotal began to look statistical. The more data that surfaced, the clearer one truth became. Something significant ruptured the Cumberland foothills in 1834, and the rupture was followed not by healing but by strategic quiet. One of the most revealing discoveries came not from folklore but from mundane bureaucracy. Property boundaries shifted in the years immediately following the church's closure. Several parcels previously owned by families whose names appeared in oral accounts of the twins. Accusations were transferred within extended kin networks. The transactions were legal, but the speed of consolidation raised questions. Land is power in frontier communities. Reorganizing land is reorganizing influence. The transfers did not suggest punishment. They suggested containment. If the twins had destabilized trust, the fastest way to rebuild control was to tighten family alliances, reduce external scrutiny, and eliminate vulnerable exposure points. A closed system can absorb shock more effectively than an open one. Modern sociologists examining the case noted that communities confronted with sudden exposure often respond in one of two ways: reform or retrenchment. Reform requires acknowledging structural failure. Retrenchment requires isolating the source of disruption and reinforcing existing hierarchies. The Cumberland foothills chose retrenchment. This interpretation does not rely on spirits or hysteria. It relies on observable patterns. The church closed rather than reformed, authority redistributed rather than confessed, records thinned rather than expanded. The twins, deaths whether from illness or otherwise, resolved the immediate crisis without requiring systemic correction. This is where the case shifts from religious horror to institutional psychology. Because once the twins were gone, the community faced a choice: examine what had been exposed or reassert silence. Silence prevailed, but silence carries cost. In the decades that followed, the foothills exhibited a pattern common to communities that suppress internal reckoning. Suspicion lingered between families. Marriages were arranged carefully, often within established networks, minimizing external integration. Outsiders were treated politely but distantly. The instinct to protect lineage overshadowed the instinct to pursue truth. Researchers studying long-term communal trauma observed that when exposure occurs without resolution, collective memory fragments. The older generation remembers vividly but avoids articulation. The middle generation inherits caution without context. The youngest generation senses tension but lacks vocabulary. This three-tiered memory structure appeared clearly in interviews conducted throughout the 20th century. Elders would grow silent when 1824. Middle-aged residents dismissed it as exaggeration. Younger residents had never heard of it at all. Yet even those who claimed ignorance often repeated the same inherited behaviors: avoid certain clearings, do not discuss missing records, treat inquiries with deflection rather than engagement. Behavior outlives narrative. In the late 1990s, a university research team proposed conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys near the suspected church site to identify unmarked graves. The project was modest, academic in tone, and legally permissible. Yet it encountered immediate resistance, not from government officials, but from local descendants. The objections were not framed in spiritual language. They were framed in terms of respect for the dead. Let them rest. One letter read, "Digging changes nothing," said another. On the surface, these objections were reasonable. But beneath them lay a familiar pattern. Exposure threatens equilibrium. The survey was postponed indefinitely. The ground remained undisturbed. In the absence of excavation, analysis turned toward psychology. How could two 9-year-old girls articulate details so specific that independent searches confirmed them? Several hypotheses persisted. One theory suggested that the twins possessed exceptional observational skills and had overheard confessions or arguments prior to speaking publicly. Children, particularly in insular communities, can absorb more than adults realize. Yet this theory struggled to account for the timing. If the knowledge existed in fragments across the settlement, why had no adult spoken first? Why did the breach occur through children? Another theory proposed that the twins may have shared a dissociative condition amplified by religious intensity. The Second Great Awakening was characterized by emotional revivalism, fainting visions, prophetic declarations. Perhaps the girls internalized communal guilt and externalized it through dramatized narratives. But this explanation, too, faltered against confirmation. Graves were found where described. Bones matched locations named before they were searched. Statistical improbability becomes difficult to dismiss when aligned repeatedly, which leaves the most unsettling possibility: that the twins did not generate knowledge, they revealed it. Revelation does not require supernatural origin, it requires breach. In tightly bound communities, secrets often exist in shared awareness without formal acknowledgement. Everyone knows, but no one names. The first to name destabilizes the pact. If the twins spoke truths known but unspoken, their impact makes sense. The terror was not about ghosts. It was about broken agreement. And when agreement fractures, institutions must choose whether to reform or to isolate. Isolation is faster. The closure of the church was not retreat from faith. It was retreat from exposure. By removing the physical structure where revelation occurred, the community removed the symbolic stage of accountability. Modern theologians reviewing the case noted that confession requires institutional courage. When confession exposes leadership, the test of integrity lies not in prayer, but in restructuring. No restructuring occurred. Instead, the source of confession was silenced by death and distance. One detail continues to unsettle researchers. After 1834, no comparable wave of disappearances occurred in the region for decades. Violence did not vanish entirely, frontier life remained dangerous, but the pattern of unreported missing individuals declined sharply. If the twins' revelations instilled fear of exposure, that fear functioned as deterrent. In this interpretation, their impact extended beyond their lives. They altered behavior. But the alteration was not rooted in moral awakening. It was rooted in surveillance anxiety. If secrets can surface unpredictably, caution increases. This raises another disturbing question. Were the twins feared because they possessed supernatural insight, or because they demonstrated that silence was fragile? Communities dependent on silence cannot tolerate evidence that silence fails, which brings the narrative forward again. In recent years, interest in unresolved American religious mysteries has surged. Podcasts, documentaries, and independent historians revisit stories once relegated to marginal footnotes. The Kentucky twins resurface periodically, not as definitive proof of the supernatural, but as anomaly resistant to neat categorization. Each retelling reframes the mystery slightly. Some emphasize the spiritual tension of the era. Others focus on the sociological breakdown. A few attempt forensic reinterpretation, but no version eliminates the core paradox. Two children described hidden graves accurately. A church closed permanently afterward. Records thinned. Behavior changed. The absence persisted. Perhaps the final layer of this story is not about explanation at all. Perhaps it is about threshold. The year 1834 marked a threshold in the Cumberland foothills, a moment when the boundary between private wrongdoing and public exposure collapsed. Threshold moments are unstable. They force choice. The community chose containment. Containment preserved order. Order preserved identity. Identity preserved lineage. But preservation did not erase imprint. Even today, if you travel through parts of eastern Kentucky and ask older residents about lost churches or forgotten twins, you will notice something subtle. A pause. Not confusion, not dismissal. Recognition, then deflection. That pause is the residue of 834. The residue of children who spoke without fear and forced adults to confront what they had normalized. The twins did not destroy the foothills. They revealed them. Revelation is rarely welcomed, especially when delivered by innocence, and so the official record remains thin. The graves remain largely unexamined. The church site remains unmarked. Science continues to search for models that fit. Faith continues to interpret through doctrine. But neither discipline resolves the core discomfort, because the most haunting element of this story is not supernatural at all. It is human. It is the understanding that exposure can come from unexpected voices, that silence is not permanent, that truth, once spoken, alters behavior, even if it does not alter belief. In 1824, two 9-year-old girls interrupted a sermon. What followed was not possession, nor revival, nor apocalypse. It was fracture. And fracture, when unaddressed, becomes structure. That structure still stands not as a building of wood and stone, but as a pattern of caution woven into generations. The twins may have died young, but the consequences of their voices did not. They persist in hesitation, in deflection, in the instinct to protect stability over clarity. And that persistence is why, nearly 2 centuries later, this case remains unresolved, not because it lacks data, but because it challenges comfort. The mystery is not whether science can explain the twins. The mystery is whether explanation would change anything at all. By the time historians began treating the case not as folklore but as a study in communal behavior, the original emotional intensity of Unexplained 4 had cooled into something quiet but no less powerful. It had become precedent. And precedent is far more enduring than fear. Fear flares and fades. Precedent reshapes instinct. In academic circles, the Kentucky twins gradually shifted from being labeled supernatural anomaly to being examined as a case study in structural disruption. Sociologists studying rural religious movements found that the foothills displayed an unusually strong aversion to public confession long after revival culture had normalized it elsewhere. Where other regions leaned into testimony as a spiritual cleansing ritual, the Cumberland foothills retreated from it almost entirely. Sermons in later decades avoided direct confrontation with communal wrongdoing. The emphasis shifted to personal humility without narrative detail. That absence was not coincidence. Exposure, once experienced as destabilizing, had taught the community to avoid the mechanism that triggered it. The church that replaced the abandoned sanctuary was architecturally modest and rhetorically cautious. Its leadership rarely referenced the past beyond generalized hardship. Records from the mid to late 19th century show careful documentation of births, marriages and deaths, but conspicuous vagueness regarding disputes or disciplinary action. It was as though the institution learned to leave less paper trail, less material for future excavation. Patterns of record-keeping often reveal as much as events themselves. The more modern archivists studied the region, the more they noticed that silence in the foothills was methodical rather than accidental. Missing pages were not random. They clustered around transitional periods. Language in official minutes softened dramatically after 1834, replacing direct acknowledgement with abstractions. Terms like incident matter and difficulty replaced concrete descriptions. This linguistic shift is common in institutions that experience public exposure without internal reform. Language becomes shield. By the late 20th century, interdisciplinary researchers began applying trauma theory to communal case studies. Trauma is often thought of as individual psychological damage, but communities can carry trauma, structurally embedding avoidance into culture. The Kentucky twins case fit this model with uncomfortable precision. Exposure occurred abruptly. Authority fractured. Reform did not fall. Silence became coping mechanism. Generations inherited avoidance without contest. In this framework, the twins' voices were not supernatural interruptions but catalytic events. They accelerated an unavoidable reckoning that the community then chose not to complete. But an incomplete reckoning does not disappear. It manifests indirectly. One such manifestation was the persistent distrust of outside authority in the foothills. Census workers reported difficulty gathering accurate data. Journalists encountered polite resistance. State initiatives were met with skepticism. While many rural regions exhibited similar tendencies, the foothills showed unusual cohesion in this regard. Cohesion born from shared history often masks shared wound. When researchers examined demographic mobility patterns, another detail emerged: families directly tied to oral accounts of the twins, Accusations showed lower outward migration rates than neighboring families. They remained rooted, intermarrying within limited networks. This consolidation may have served to maintain narrative control and prevent external reinterpretation of local history. Again, containment. The structural consequence of 18434 was not only silence, it was insulation. And insulation, while protective, reduces permeability. It limits the exchange of ideas. It narrows acceptable discourse. It reinforces internal hierarchy. The twins. Exposure threatened hierarchy. The response fortified it. Modern theologians revisiting revival-era case studies noted that communities often face crisis when spiritual rhetoric collides with hidden moral realities. In some regions, exposure led to institutional transparency. In others, it led to fragmentation and splinter congregations. The Cumberland foothills chose a third path, consolidation without confession. Consolidation maintains surface order, but surface order does not eliminate underlying tension. By the early 2000s, advancements in forensic anthropology renewed interest in unmarked burial sites across the American South. Advocacy groups pushed for identification of anonymous graves, particularly those linked to violence. Kentucky was included in broader mapping initiatives. Yet when proposals touched the foothills region, progress slowed. Funding allocations shifted elsewhere. Permissions stalled. Land access negotiations collapsed quietly. Publicly, this appeared bureaucratic. Privately, it resembled generational instinct. Protect the ground, protect the lineage, protect the silence. In interviews conducted with elderly residents during this period, a recurring phrase surfaced: "We have lived long enough with what we know." The phrasing is telling. It does not deny knowledge. It asserts endurance of it. Endurance is not absolution. It is adaptation. By this point, the twins had been gone for over 150 years. Their names were no longer attached to living memory. Yet their impact lingered in posture, in hesitation, in what topics closed conversations rather than opened them. The longer the silence persisted, the more the twins' story transformed into symbol, not of spirits, not of divine judgment, but of threshold. They marked a moment when innocence disrupted complicity. And complicity, once disrupted, does not forget. Modern scholars exploring child witness phenomena note that children in insular communities sometimes become inadvertent truth-tellers precisely because they lack full understanding of social contracts. They repeat what they hear without calculating consequence. They connect fragments adults keep compartmentalized. When children speak these connections aloud, adults confront the collapse of boundaries they rely on. The Kentucky twins fit this profile disturbingly well. If they had absorbed confessions, arguments, and whispers during travel with their preacher father, and then articulated those fragments in a new community, their knowledge may not have been supernatural at all, but the effect was, because the community had not expected its silence to travel. Even if the twins' knowledge originated in overheard truths, the revelation exposed not only individuals but the fragility of concealment itself. And fragility breeds defensiveness. One cannot overlook the timing. 1834 was not merely a local anomaly. It occurred during a broader wave of American religious intensity. The Second Great Awakening emphasized public testimony, communal accountability, and visible repentance. In many places, this fervor empowered social reform movements. In the foothills, it triggered collapse. Perhaps the twins' revelations occurred at precisely the wrong moment when rhetoric of moral purity clashed most sharply with buried violence. The dissonance would have been unbearable. Rather than reconcile rhetoric and reality, the community severed the stage where reconciliation could occur. Close the church, remove the witnesses, reassert order. And yet, 2 centuries later, the story refuses closure, because closure requires conclusion. And the Kentucky twins case does not provide one. There is no documented confession that explains every grave, no forensic report tying every bone to a name, no preserved sermon transcript capturing the exact words spoken. Instead, there is pattern of exposure, pattern of retrenchment, pattern of silence, pattern of altered behavior. For experts studying communal moral fracture, this pattern is more instructive than any single supernatural claim. It demonstrates how quickly institutions pivot from transparency to containment when authority is threatened. It illustrates how child voices can destabilize adult agreements. It reveals how silence, once chosen as survival mechanism, becomes cultural norm. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it suggests that truth does not need supernatural origin to produce effects that feel supernatural. In the foothills, nothing dramatic followed the twins. Deaths, no haunting, no mass exodus, no faunal trials. Instead, there was slow recalibration. And recalibration, though quiet, reshapes history more profoundly than spectacle. Today, when scholars revisit the case, they often describe it not as unsolved mystery, but as unresolved reckoning. The distinction matters. A mystery invites explanation. A reckoning demands response. The twins delivered the first. The community declined the second. And that refusal became legacy. In contemporary discourse about institutional accountability, the Kentucky twins case surfaces occasionally as historical precedent. It serves as reminder that exposure alone does not guarantee reform. Exposure can just as easily provoke defensive consolidation. The lesson is not about ghosts. It is about governance. It is about how communities protect themselves from their own truths. It is about the cost of preserving order at the expense of clarity. And it is about how children, precisely because they stand outside fully formed social contracts, can disrupt systems built on unspoken agreements. In the end, what science cannot fully explain is not how the twins knew what they knew. It is how a community chose to respond. Why exposure led to silence rather than transformation. Why graves confirmed publicly did not trigger institutional overhaul. Why the stage of confession was dismantled instead of fortified. Those questions remain. They linger in archives, in interviews, in patterns of land ownership, in record gaps, in behavioral caution passed from parent to child without explanation. The twins are gone. The preacher vanished. The church rotted. But the architecture of avoidance built in their wake endures. And that endurance may be the most macabre mystery of all. Not that 2 9-year-old girls spoke impossible truths, but that an entire community decided survival required never fully acknowledging them. And so we arrive not at a conclusion, but at the edge of one. Because some stories do not end with revelation. They end with recognition. Recognition that what unsettles us most is not the possibility of the supernatural, but the familiarity of human silence. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since 1834. And the Cumberland foothills no longer resemble the fragile frontier settlement that once trembled beneath whispered names. Highways cut through hills that once hid unmarked graves. Children attend schools that teach scientific reasoning and historical methodology. Church buildings stand with reinforced foundations and modern lighting. The world has advanced, and yet the question remains, not how the twins knew, but what we do when truth surfaces unexpectedly. History is filled with examples of exposure moments when hidden wrongdoing becomes public knowledge. Institutions often respond predictably. Some reform, some fragment, some rebrand, and some, like the foothills community, close ranks. Silence can be mistaken for peace, but peace built on avoidance is not stability. It is suspension. The Kentucky twins case has evolved over time from supernatural mystery to sociological study, from religious terror to institutional analysis. Yet beneath every academic lens lies the same core discomfort. 2 children disrupted a community, equilibrium by speaking what others refused to say. That disruption revealed more than crimes. It revealed dependency. Dependency on silence. Dependency on reputation. Dependency on mutual protection. When that dependency fractured, the response was not transparency. It was insulation. Insulation preserved order, but it did not eliminate memory. Memory migrated into behavior. Behavior migrated into culture. Culture outlived documentation. Even now, when modern researchers approach the case with detached objectivity, they encounter subtle resistance, not overt hostility but careful limitation. Interviews granted with boundaries. Records provided selectively. Conversations redirected when approaching sensitive intersections. This is not unique to the foothills. It is universal. Communities everywhere prefer continuity over confrontation. And yet, the longer silence persists, the heavier it becomes. One of the final surviving letters from the region, written by a descendant of a family mentioned in early oral accounts, contains a sentence that echoes across generations: "We inherited more than land." That line is haunting, not because it suggests ghosts, but because it acknowledges transmission. Transmission of silence. Transmission of caution. Transmission of unresolved tension. Modern forensic capabilities could, in theory, revisit the burial sites. DNA analysis might identify remains. Genealogical databases might connect bones to living descendants. Legal historians could reconstruct property shifts in greater detail. The technology exists, but technology does not compel action. Action requires willingness, and willingness confronts cost. Reopening 818 would not merely satisfy curiosity. It would challenge lineage, complicate narratives of community resilience, and potentially destabilize reputations long stabilized by time. Time does not absolve, it obscures. The twins' voices, though silenced physically, accomplished something irreversible. They demonstrated that silence is permeable. Once a secret has been named publicly, it cannot fully return to invisibility. It may be ignored. It may be minimized. It may be reframed. But it remains, and that permanence is what unsettles us. Because if children in 834 could rupture concealment and no era is immune, no institution invulnerable, no agreement guaranteed, the most chilling aspect of the story is not the graves, nor the vanished preacher, nor even the church that closed its doors forever. It is the fact that exposure required innocence. Adults entrenched in hierarchy did not speak. Authority did not self-correct. Truth emerged through those least equipped to calculate consequence. In many modern scandals, religious, political, corporate, the pattern echoes. Whistleblowers are often outsiders. Disruption often comes from those who do not fully understand the system they challenge. The system's first instinct is rarely reform. It is containment. The Kentucky Twins case is not a relic of primitive superstition. It is a mirror. A mirror held up to communal psychology. A demonstration of how quickly moral rhetoric collapses under factual revelation. A reminder that stability built on concealment is inherently fragile. As scholars continue to revisit the archives, new interpretations will emerge. Some will lean into neurological explanations, shared psychosis, memory distortion, suggestibility heightened by revivalist fervor. Others will explore theological frameworks, arguing for divine intervention or spiritual warfare. These debates will continue, but beneath them lies a quieter truth. Whether supernatural or psychological, the twins' knowledge exposed real graves, and the community's response reshaped its future. The story does not require ghosts to remain macabre. It requires only recognition of human behavior. In the present day, if you walk through the foothills at dusk, there is no visible sign of what occurred. No plaque marks the abandoned church. No memorial honors the twins. The land appears serene, almost indifferent, yet serenity can coexist with memory. And memory, when unexamined, becomes undertone. The undertone of 834. It lives in the way certain topics close conversations, in the way local history skips from one decade to the next without lingering, in the instinct to protect the ground from excavation. It lives in the collective understanding that some knowledge destabilizes more than it clarifies. Perhaps that is why the story refuses to resolve, because resolution would require final judgment. And judgment, once formalized, disrupts inheritance. The twins never received formal vindication, nor formal condemnation. Their graves, unmarked, symbolize ambiguity. They exist as threshold figures between explanation and mystery, between innocence and accusation, between exposure and silence. In the end, science may someday offer a convincing model explaining how two children could synthesize scattered information into coherent revelation. Or perhaps it will not. Perhaps the explanation is less important than the consequence. Because what the twins proved, intentionally or not, is that truth, when spoken aloud, reconfigures power. It may not topple it, it may not reform it, but it alters it. An alteration, once experienced, cannot be undone. So the macabre mystery of the Kentucky Twins is not a puzzle demanding solution. It is a question demanding reflection. When innocence speaks, do we listen? When exposure fractures comfort, do we reform or retreat? When graves are found where silence insisted there were none, do we excavate further or close the door? The Cumberland foothills answered in 1800. They closed the door. The world has changed since then, but the dilemma has not. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you not because of spirits, but because of recognition, then you understand why it endured. Because the most haunting mysteries are not those science cannot explain. They are those we choose not to fully confront. If you felt the weight of this history, subscribe to the Black Timeline, tap the bell icon, so you never miss the stories history tried to bury, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this case affected you. Do you believe the twins accessed something beyond reason, or did they simply speak what others were too afraid to admit? The graves may remain hidden, the church may remain gone, but the question still stands. And sometimes the question is the part that refuses to die.